Guys, I have an awesome guest for today. I have Alexander Mercouris, legal scholar, editor-in-chief at the Duran. He's going to be speaking with me about the Steele Dossier and basically how Christopher Steele lost a case. The media in the United States, for whatever reason, shockingly, has nothing to say about it after covering for 3 years. However, we here are going to cover it. So welcome.
My great pleasure to be with you today.
My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. I have with me, as I said in the beginning, an amazing guest, Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Welcome to the show.
Delighted to be with you. Great pleasure to be with you today.
So, I brought you on because I want to have a conversation about the Christopher Steele and the document that basically started all of this Trump and Russia hysteria here in the United States, something that I honestly call a soft coup because it was bogus from the jump. The beginnings of that document was basically, well, yeah, the Republicans started it, but Clinton basically was paying Christopher Steele to do this. Now, everybody kept screaming at Trump and Russia. Nobody cared about the intervention of Britain, potentially, or somebody international from Britain engaging into our political space. That didn't matter, and they would say, well, Clinton paid for it, so it's not that big of a deal. Well, it is a big deal when that dossier was dodgy. They knew that dossier was dodgy, and yet it was still used as the preface to basically try to take down a president. Now, can you basically explain what happened recently in regards to a lawsuit, the origins of the lawsuit, what the lawsuit was about, and the findings of that lawsuit?
Right. This lawsuit is about a specific allegation which is made in this extraordinary dossier. Now, in it, Steele alleges in the dossier that there is a sort of connection between Russia and Trump, and that this is being facilitated by a big Russian bank called Alpha Bank, which is some kind of communication conduit, that it's, sending email messages to the Trump campaign, and they're going backwards and forwards, and there's all kinds of contacts there. And that the people who own this Russian bank, who are two big, very well-known in Russia businessmen, Mikhail Friedman and Piotr Aven, that they are somehow orchestrating all this activity on Mr. Putin's instructions, Putin being, of course, the president of Russia. So it was about this allegation. Now, these two businessmen tried originally to sue Steele for defamation. They said this is completely not true. The dossier says things about us, that we take bribes, that we are agents of the Russian government, that we're close to Putin, which have no reality. And our reputations are being trashed, and we want to sue Steele for defamation. The High Court said, no, we can't do that for technical reasons because you're Russians and this is Britain and you don't really have reputations here to damage. So what they did instead was they brought this claim, which is essentially aiming at achieving the same thing. But it was on Britain's data protection laws, and it said that this information in the dossier about us is untrue. So there's a huge hearing. This case has gone on for years, by the way. There was a big hearing in March, and now the judge, who is a High Court judge, which in Britain is a very senior judge indeed, looking at all the evidence, hearing what everybody had to say, hearing Steele, hearing these two businessmen, said that these allegations that Steele has made about them and about their whole role in Russia and about their connections to Putin and about their transmissions of information backwards and forwards to the Trump campaign, none of it is true. All of it is poorly researched. In fact, it turns out that Steele says he got this information from sources, but didn't check it. He just did a quick internet search and didn't do anything more than that. So it shows the shoddy way in which this dossier was put together, and it is now a High Court judge in a court judgment in England and the High Court in London who is saying this.
That is profound. That is profound. The wild part is, in the United States, they knew that the document was dodgy to begin with, though. I mean, that's kind of the key point, right? Still, it's an Oppo document, for all intents and purposes. It's just basically a document that they use to try to throw at and slander your opponent in order to try to make it look bad. I think the difference with this one is they didn't use this as opposition research from the outside the political space of just one campaign to another. This was actually stovepiped into our intelligence, like in order to basically go after the person using the legal apparatus to do so. That is monstrously different. So what does this mean here in the U.S.? I mean, for all intents and purposes, the document is utterly and entirely discredited. And for 3 years, a case that was basically built off of that discredited document had invaded our media space.
I think you put your finger on it because, right, Steele is frankly something of a charlatan, in my opinion. This dossier in itself is a load of nonsense, to say it frankly. But it was the people who used it and what they used it for, which is really serious. What happened in 2016 is that one side in a presidential election, and I really want to stress this is an election between two establishment figures. Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, they're both establishment figures. This is a factional battle within the US establishment. They used, one of those people was able to recruit, enlist the intelligence and security agencies of the United States in order to help her win. Now, what has come out of this judgment is very interesting. You have to read it through carefully, but the judge lays it out very clearly, is that the interactions between Steele, Christopher Steele, and the FBI in the United States were even more extensive than we had realized up to now. Steele was talking to the FBI on at the latest. His first contact with them was on the 5th of July, 2016, 3 weeks before Crossfire Hurricane, this is this investigation that looks into collusion, was initiated. The FBI have tried to claim it wasn't about Steele's dossier. That wasn't what caused them to open this investigation. It was other things, and they didn't really know about the dossier.
Well, and just so we're clear, though, Crossfire Hurricane was basically used to spy on the Trump campaign. I mean, that was the whole Carter Page stuff.
Absolutely.
And they kept saying, I mean, originally we thought that apparently Papadopoulos had a drunken conversation with a guy, and that guy, well, Misfit, if I'm not mistaken, and so all of this stuff came into play. Basically, Misfit saying I had a conversation, or Papadopoulos saying he got the information from Misfit, but nobody knew where Misfit was. This, like, all of this stuff, and basically they were spying on Carter Page. Then this led to them lying about even the reasons why they were lying on Carter Page. I mean, they were changing information. One of the agents just got arrested for changing the information in regards to just lying about it. They even were told by the CIA that, yes, this guy's a spook. He's working for us. And they still continued the investigation in regards to spying on Trump's campaign. So this was massively big. You're
absolutely right, because of course this story that Crossfire Hurricane was started because of a drunken conversation that was had between two people in a hotel in London, Mifsud and Papadopoulos, and a follow-up conversation between Papadopoulos and an Australian diplomat in a London wine bar. I mean, this doesn't make any kind of sense. And it doesn't look to be true. This judgment, it's a High Court judgment, really contradicts it. And what the High Court judgment is now saying is that this dossier of Steele's, which was used by the FBI to mount all that surveillance, all the FISA warrants on Carter Page that we know about, were largely based on this dossier. This High Court judgment, an official court finding by the High Court in England, says is shoddily prepared, completely untrue on one of its key points. And of course, there's other things in the dossier also, but there's no reason to think that, in fact, any other part of the dossier is true either. And in fact, we have the Inspector General of the FBI himself saying that it just didn't really amount to anything. And you're quite right. They knew it wasn't true. Of course they did.
When did they start looking into, what was the FBI's assertion in regards to when did they actually start looking into, like basically using the Steele Dossier? Because you're right. They're arguing that, no, the Steele Dossier wasn't the primary mover and shaker for the reason why we opened the case. And ultimately it was. Like you said, Crossfire Hurricane opened up 3 weeks after they were introduced to the dossier and started using the dossier. But the FBI said that it was months later, correct?
Absolutely. They've claimed that, they had some knowledge of this dossier, but not very much. And it was only in September 2016, around, 2 months after Crossfire Hurricane is opened, that it suddenly occurred to them, wow, we've got this dossier and it's, going to be the frame for all our investigation because it's obviously plausible and it's, believable, and we start writing off all those FISA warrants based upon it. Well, this judgment really calls all that into question. They knew about this dossier at a much higher level and in a much more detailed way than they had been saying. And this, by the way, the judge got this information from Steele's notes. Steele did apparently a detailed note of this meeting with the FBI on the 5th of July 2016. He met with them again, apparently, in August 2016. So he had much more extensive contacts with the FBI than has been admitted up to now. And you're absolutely right. It was never really credible. And in fact, we also know that this FBI knew almost from the beginning, in fact, from the beginning, that it was opposition research. Steele knew he was working for Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, this is also something in the judgment, knew he was working for her. So, we had that connection right from the beginning. And the FBI knew exactly whom Steele was working for. So all of these pieces are now falling into place.
To make that worse, the FBI lied in order to get the FISA warrant, saying that they never disclosed that this guy is an opposition research guy working on behalf of Hillary Clinton when they went to get the FISA warrant. That's mad. That's monstrous.
Well, it is. It's extraordinary. And again, they didn't disclose that this was opposition research. They absolutely didn't. There were lots of things about this dossier that they didn't disclose. The fact that Steele was also talking to the newspapers, and again, the judge says Steele was enthusiastically talking to the newspapers. He was talking to the newspapers at every opportunity.
Right there. That was the other interesting part. So Richard Engel, he's a journalist here in the United States. He went on Rachel Maddow, I think this was in January, and he said, we've been getting this push about information. Basically, he's talking about the dossier. He says, we haven't been able to verify it. We haven't been able to legitimize the document. He says, we've been trying to reach out to people. We haven't been able to get it. We've even gone so far as to say, look, if this document is true, then give us the details and, put us in contact with these people. None of that has taken place. In January, they knew. And yet that didn't stop them. I think the mania, that's not the word for it, the grandiosity of this, I think is the thing that's impressive to me, right? This wasn't enough to say, okay, we're going to hit them with this, like in the newspapers. They went specifically to the political instrument and to the investigative instruments of this country in order to use this document to try to get Trump. And I think that's the part that I think people miss. They often want to investigate Trump, but they don't necessarily see entirely the value in investigating how on earth did something that was basically ludicrous, opposition research, turn into something that would almost took down the president. We had the Mueller investigation, and even after the Mueller investigation, these people were still yelling, Trump and Russia, Trump and Russia, Trump and Russia, based off of this nonsense, that Trump got peed on by a hooker or whatever, or watched it. And then you have people fight like, no, parts of the document is true. It's like the document is dodgy all the way through. This is mind-blowing to me. So I wonder, do you think that this is going to be used in the United States in any particular fashion? Does Trump even have a defamation lawsuit potentially against Steele for putting out a document like this?
I don't know. I mean, in Britain, perhaps very difficult because of the jurisdictional issues. In the United States, I think what needs to happen, actually, is for Mr. Steele to be asked to come to the United States and to answer some questions there in a public forum, perhaps in a proper investigation. And conceivably, if he has, fabricated much of this material, which he quite possibly has done, then he's been paid for it. He's been paid good money for it by the Democrats, lots of money, $20,000 a month. So I think there might be actual claims there, both in the civil and the criminal courts. I think you're absolutely right, by the way, to point out the absolute grandiosity of this, because please remember, this was done to an establishment candidate, Donald Trump. You may not like Donald Trump. You may think he's incompetent, a megalomaniac, a narcissist, all those kind of racist, all those sort of things. If they can do it against him, they can do it against anybody. They can do it against Bernie Sanders. They can do it against a more left-wing candidate than Bernie Sanders. They can do it against anybody at any level of American society on any issue. They just have to find someone like Steele to put something like this together, and then the entire machinery of the FBI is set in motion, and surveillance is then carried out against them, and media campaigns are run, and legal challenges are faced, and all those sort of things.
One of the other things that need to be made clear too is how media is not a passive actor in this.
No.
People have this thought that media is objective. Media is not objective. Everyone puts their stake down somewhere in regards to rationality. I rationally look at the world through this lens. Okay, fair enough. But you are looking at it through a lens. It's not, floating in the void. Media was used as a weapon in this, like big time. And people sometimes miss that political actors use the notion of access and everything else to create relationships with people who are in the media that would toe a very specific line that they would want in order to contain that access. Especially, they have their own political discretion. They may hate Donald Trump's guts. So any story that comes out like this, basically, they will run full-throatedly without necessarily having the background of information to back the story up. They could not get this out, though. And so what they ended up doing was having a meeting with Trump. And in having the meeting with Trump to basically say, hey, the Steele dossier is this. This is a dossier that's floating out there. I just think you need to know, Mr. President. And then goes out and immediately leaks it to the press that the Donald Trump has just been briefed on issues pertaining to the Steele dossier, which automatically gives it a level of legitimacy because Donald Trump is being briefed on it. Otherwise, why would Donald Trump be briefed on it? It's like all of these things, these mechanisms had to come into play in order to make this work. I think, I am mad. I can't stand Donald Trump. And yet I look at this and I think this is so jump the shark. Democrats were able to push this. I mean, even going after Manafort. When they went through with this notion that the information started coming out about Manafort down from the Ukraine. And you find out that Democrats had an operative that had been getting information in order to try to get that information released because they also had a relationship with the Ukraine, considering Joe Biden was the viceroy for all intents and purposes. And this information comes out and it hits Manafort. Now, it has nothing to do with the election, but that doesn't necessarily stop people from saying, hey, there's another guy that got busted during the election. So it looks like something's there with Donald Trump and Russia. And all of this, the underpinnings was based on a document that has been fully and fairly and utterly discredited. In the UK,
This is absolutely true.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I mean, this is an inquisition, a political inquisition has been conducted in the United States against certain people because they're associated with Donald Trump. They may not be likable people. I mean, Paul Manafort, is as corrupt as it gets. I mean, he was up to all kinds of terrible things in Ukraine. Not, by the way, the things that he was actually probably, pursued for. But, let's not, glamorize these people. Roger Stone is just a fabulist and an idiot, frankly. At least is my view of him, who goes on media and makes up stories about how important he is. They may not be good people. They may not be nice people. But in the United States, you're supposed to have due process, rule of law, constitutional protections. And those things broke down as
Completely.
part of a political agenda. And the people who should be worried about that ultimately are people who are vulnerable. Now, if they can do these things to a person like Paul Manafort, who again is a politically powerful, well-connected person, they can do it to anybody. If they're prepared to break procedure and break the law to go after people like him, where do they stop?
And
They can do it to anyone.
There's something else I want to point out with that. For Roger Stone, like you said, these are not great people. Like, so don't misunderstand me. Nobody is crying in the wind for Roger Stone. But they went after Roger Stone and descended on his house like his house was a compound. Like Stone had guns in the back and that he was going to come out shooting and they were going to take me alive. It was like astonishing. In the UK, you guys have a law against lying in politics, right?
Yeah.
See, we don't have that here.
No.
We can, so if they want to create an opposition research document full of lies, it's legal as legal can be. It's First Amendment, right? I could say whatever I want. Now, there's a catch with that, with defamation or libel. That's different.
Yeah.
Like, you can't lie and say Donald Trump got peed on by a hooker if Donald Trump didn't get peed on by a hooker and he thinks that hurts his character. Considering he paid off a porn star, I don't even know if that would hurt his character one way or the other. But we don't have that here. And so when they put out a document like that, that document is fair game. So I would be curious on what they could do here in the United States to kind of make that much more plain. And I would be shocked if Donald Trump doesn't try to find some way of using this document to help himself out, to make it that much more plain of how egregious all of this has been. So what if you had to pinpoint anything in all of this, and I'll close on this, that shocks you, that is the worst or most pernicious aspect of this, what would it be? And it could be more than one thing, but I find all of this, I think the grandiosity of it for me is the most mind-blowing part. It's like, it's not, look, it's one thing if she came out with that as opposition research and just dropped it into the press. And it's like, Trump got peed on by a hooker. Okay, fair enough. All of that's fair game. Fine. People do that. Hillary Clinton had the thing, Obama is a Muslim or something, had him bending down and the thing, all that Kenyan stuff. But that stuff gets fair game and just considered political fodder. I mean, going back, we had one presidential candidate where you have these little stickers. This was before television, of this guy was had a venereal disease. This guy had murdered a man, some horrible stuff that people used to say. But the problem is that's not how it was done.
No.
The problem is they use the instruments of our political system that is supposed to be used for investigative functions and had enough pull and resources in those places to do this. And I think that's where the issue comes in. So for you, what would it be?
Well, I mean, the sheer brazenness of this whole thing. As I said, they knew perfectly well that this dossier was a pile of steaming nonsense. When they had that famous meeting in January 2017, the one you mentioned, between Trump and the intelligence officers, by that point, all the people who they'd interviewed who'd been sources had told them this is all a load of nonsense. Steele has exaggerated massively what we were saying. So the FBI were at that point trying to basically blackmail Trump. And they were doing all of these things in the most extraordinarily open way. As you correctly said earlier, they actually changed the wording of an email from the CIA to make it out that Carter Page, the CIA was denying that Carter Page was actually one of their assets, when in fact he was, in order to justify spying on him. I mean, it's just extraordinary stuff, unbelievable stuff. And if they can do that, that is really, really concerning. And the reason they think they can do that is because the other point you made about the fact that the media in the United States isn't working anymore. There's been a total collapse of journalistic ethics because stories are being reproduced absurd stories are being reproduced to serve political agendas without even an attempted fact checking. And on top of that, the media in the United States has now clearly become so concentrated and so monolithic that it is all but impossible for more diverse comments and views to circulate freely and for information to circulate freely. Nonetheless, I expect that as the election looms and as we get John Durham's investigation, more of these things that we've been talking about today, about Steele, about his dossier, about Russiagate, about the criminal violations that took place, they will gradually seep into the public consciousness, and we'll see what results from that.
You have no idea how much I'm waiting for that John Durham investigation. Oh, you have no idea. You have no idea. And by putting John Durham on, John Durham is considered a straight shooter. And so it's not this thing of, oh, Donald Trump's henchman is doing X or Y. Don't get me wrong. They're going to say that regardless of what he comes out with. But if he comes out and says Brennan or some of these other people that were involved, like I can't think of the other guy's name, but these people were involved in this. Oh man, you're talking about explosive going into the election. Let me ask you a question on Britain for the moment. What is going on with Boris Johnson? So I want to ask in two veins. One, in the context of COVID-19 and how the British government has handled COVID-19 and what has been the public's perspective of the way they handle it, because it doesn't necessarily seem like Keir Starmer is doing all that great in regards to, he's just a Blair Labour person, meaning Labour for the most part is dead. But how has the public accepted what has taken place from the standpoint of the way Johnson has handled the COVID-19 virus?
Well, I'm going to say straightforwardly, I think Johnson's handling of the COVID-19 virus has been a disaster. It even makes the United States look good, and that's saying something, actually. What we've got in Britain is we've probably got around 60,000 deaths. This is a figure which even the British government accepts is probably the correct one. And that has happened. And that has happened because the British government dragged its heels on, having a lockdown, didn't introduce proper. I'm sorry, somebody's at my door.
You're fine. You're fine. Go ahead. Do you need to answer?
No, my wife's going to do it. Okay. So it didn't establish a proper testing mechanism, and crazily did what Mayor de Blasio also did in New York, which is get all the old people out of the hospitals, put them in the care homes, and of course that meant that COVID-19 spread like wildfire across the care homes. This is an absolute disaster, and he managed to get ill as well, and he was almost at death's door. So it's a disastrous mismanagement of the pandemic, and it also comes on top of a catalogue of other failures. And yet here is the paradox. Despite the fact that the British public accepts that Boris Johnson has mismanaged the pandemic crisis, despite all the many problems that people are talking about with Johnson's government, the fact that it's generally accepted to be incompetent, the Conservatives are still ahead in the polls. Not just still ahead, their lead over the last 2 weeks seems to be, if anything, increasing. Why is that so? I think the answer is that the Labour Party chose the wrong leader to succeed Jeremy Corbyn. They went for the safe pair of hands. They've got themselves someone who you described him as Blair Mark II. I would say that he's Blair without Blair's flair. I mean, Blair had a lot of charisma, whatever you might think of him. Starmer doesn't even have that.
He does not. He does not. Look, when Jeremy Corbyn was running against Theresa May, and I think it was the first election, when Corbyn first got that seat, they were like just derisive. And because they were trying to make this argument that he shouldn't even be there and he doesn't have standing to be there. So if we create this perspective in anything and everything that we do is derisive, then the public will also see him in those terms. Well, the problem is they lost massively in that election. And they lost even with Corbyn's own party trying to tank him in that election.
Yeah.
The people in the United States, I try to point out to them that our politics are very similar, at least in the sense of we are like your darker brother. Like we're a tick further to the right than where you guys are. But that you guys, if you continue with these kind of conservative governments, it would be the same way. It would be one plank after the next taken away over the course of time, where people within the context of their generation can't entirely see the difference, but it's happening nonetheless. Starmer is a horrible choice. Now, we have a pandemic. We have all of these people out of work. Just talking about the United States, I think there's like 30 million people still out of a job. I would imagine Britain may be similar in regard to the number of people that are dead in some kind of comparison. And when you have the left-leaning party and you say, okay, this is your moment. Do you? This is what you do. This is what you do. This is what you're supposed to do. And they pick Starmer. Oh, that's a horrible pick. That's a horrible pick. Like, this is an FDR moment in regards to what needs to take place and what the public is even to some degree expecting to take place. And Starmer cannot stand against Bojo. It's a horrible matchup. Theresa May and Corbyn. Corbyn had a better end of that matchup between the two people, even though stylistically he doesn't match up well against Bojo. You could see it as they were going into the election, not to mention they hobbled him because they kept trying to force him to basically take this weird position of not being for Brexit or against it, but I'm just going to be in betweeners, which is weird. What do you think is going to happen with that then? I mean, if Starmer is going to lose horribly if they go into an election right now, and if Bojo, even with all of these people dying and everything else, is still winning, like that means Labour to some degree is just dead. Am I wrong on that? I mean,
you're not wrong at all. I think you put your finger on it. I mean, I think I've never felt more concerned about the future of the Labour Party, of which, by the way, I have been a member for much of my life, than I am now, because frankly, I don't see this as an opposition party anymore. I mean, it's not providing what, for me, is the proper function of an opposition party, which is alternative policies and an alternative view of where Britain should go. And can I say Britain desperately needs an alternative view of where she should go, because it's going not just in the wrong direction, but it's not going effectively in the wrong direction. I mean, Johnson has this extraordinary, fatal combination of being both misguided and incompetent. I mean, Thatcher was misguided, but she was at least competent. So you would expect Labour to provide an alternative. But what Starmer is doing, first of all, he's boring. So, I mean, he doesn't say anything very much. And when he does say it to people, he doesn't say it very well. He's very good at, asking questions in the House of Commons about, a few thousand people follow that. I mean, it's not really a big issue for most people.
And he can't do the aspirational politics.
He can't. And the other thing he's doing is he does what every right-wing Labour leader does when he's in trouble, which is attack the left of his party.
Yeah.
This is a time when Britain, public feeling in Britain, especially amongst young people who are very much part of Labour's base, is moving further to the left. So the result is he is demoralising Labour's electoral base, which is, I think, the reason why the Conservatives are actually increasing their lead. It is a deeply misguided policy, and if you look at it from a British perspective, certainly from a left-wing British perspective, you need to be very depressed about it, because we have a very incompetent and misguided government, but we don't really have an opposition to it.
So explain to me how this works in the UK. So in the United States, we have basically people can dump as much money as they want to in politics. That is obscene. And if you're anywhere else around the world, it was like, wow, that sounds corrupt. It is corrupt. Call it what it is, right? Obama gets $1 billion, and people act like he's not going to do what he needs to do in order to get that $1 billion. That doesn't work that way in the UK, though. But there is either, I guess, an ideological divide in the way that it still works. Yeah, explain how that works there. I mean, we
Yeah,
that
I
we have
mean,
here in the United States this thing of you have nowhere else to go, because you end up with just basically two political parties. In fact, our laws and everything else work to keep it that way, meaning to keep it ossified in order to prevent any other parties. And Republicans and Democrats have basically gotten together and found a way to prevent anybody else from getting into debate. Now, I've argued that these are not two parties. These are basically the exact same party with a gradient of difference between the two that they've conned America into believing are two parties. There's no secondary perspective of the world. And what I mean by that is, if you're in the UK, you will get either the Socialist Party, you will get the Labour, you will get the Greens, you get the Liberal Democrats, you get all of these parties. And at any particular time, or even S&P, and they float, meaning people can float between the various differences in order to increase or decrease the share of those different parties over time. Or you may get a wave election of a party that didn't necessarily start off as being a big party, but all of a sudden subsume the other votes. How does it work there if that's the case? I mean, do you guys still have that aspect of you have nowhere else to go for like a Starmer? I mean, you guys have like a Green Party and these other parties. Wouldn't
we
they
do.
just subsume the difference in the vote totals for people who are more to the left?
We are going steadily more towards the American style of politics that you've been describing. We're not quite there yet. Now, once upon a time, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party were distinct. I mean, the Conservative Party was the party of the middle class. It was supported by business. It was funded by companies. British companies used to make donations to the Conservative Party quite openly. Labour was the party of organised labour. It was principally funded through the trade unions. That isn't true of either party anymore. Now, principally, they get funding from private individuals, many of whom, by the way, are not British. So in that respect, we're much more like the United States than we used to be. And also, we see a convergence between the two parties. I mean, both Labour and Conservative now, essentially, we're talking about the mainstream, they have very similar perspectives on how society should be run, on how the economy should be run, on tax, or you name it, they're very like it. I mean, they will always look to try and find issues that will distinguish them from each other, but they're very narrow issues. However, we do have, I think, a more open system in that we do indeed have parties like the Greens. We do indeed have parties like, possibly, the Scottish nationalists in Scotland. So we have a more diverse political system than you have still in the United States. But that diversity is becoming restricted more and more all the time. When a genuine alternative was presented in the form of Jeremy Corbyn, you've just described the extraordinary trouble he faced, opposition within his own party, his own campaign HQ working against him to try and ensure that he lost the election. This is his own party's machine, is actually election machine, is voting against its leader in order to try and lose an election. Just think of that. I mean, all of that was going on in Britain whilst Jeremy Corbyn was there. They've now got the establishment figure, and they say, well, he's the only alternative. If you don't like Johnson, you must vote for him. What will actually happen, also like the United States, more and more people will simply stop voting at all. They will say, this election system really doesn't work for us. We're not represented in it. No party that's involved really speaks for us. So we just won't bother to vote. We will gradually withdraw from the electoral politics. And because politics abhors a vacuum, you will see eventually, over time, a rise in politics outside the political and electoral system, which you're also starting to see to some extent in the United States.
Yeah, with all of those people protesting, I mean, that's basically what you're beginning to see.
Well, it's very early stage.
Yeah.
It completely lacks focus. It's easily manipulated by powerful forces, but it is a release of political energy.
That is very true.
We will start to see something like that, I think, happen in Britain. So we'll see. Mm-hmm.
Let me, and again, same thing happened in the U.S. with Sanders. I mean, basically, you had a party who said we would go to a brokered convention if it means stopping Sanders, which each and every one of them knew that if you rip the nomination out of Sanders' hands in a brokered convention, you lose the you're going to lose the race. Nobody is going to vote for your candidate, regardless of how bad Donald Trump is under those circumstances. They were willing to do it in a heartbeat. It's like, and they would tell lefties, you have nowhere else to go. You have nowhere else to go. Blue, no matter who. They would say that in order to kind of absolve themselves from any notion of either blame or try to make the point of, well, we're incrementally better than them, and so pragmatically speaking, you should vote for us. Like these type of arguments that are being made because of how bad the candidate is. Here, I think 70% of the population that's voting for Joe Biden is doing so in order to vote against Trump. Meaning, so any notion of an affirmative case of why you should win is out the window. It's just
exactly.
Yeah.
It's exactly turning out. See, with Jeremy Corbyn, it was different. People, I mean, I saw this myself. I went to see him speak once, and I was just astonished. I mean, the line of people queuing up seemed to reach to infinity. I mean, it just went on and on. Thousands of people.
See, I think the only thing wrong with Jeremy Corbyn was, and tell me if I'm wrong, the issue was weakness.
Yeah,
the issue wasn't policy. I mean, from a political standpoint, he was a juggernaut, and he could. I saw him, like, the man was amazing. Like, because what he was saying was basically, look, Britain can be run either for the rich or the poor, and we need to have a contrast in regards to whatever the Conservative Party is, and we need to have an affirmative case to why we in this government should be doing what we were doing, and the public massively responded to that. Like I said, the issue was weakness, where he gets cobbled by people in his party that are not necessarily working to his best interests. And he will give deference to them. Like, so Williams, he throws overboard. Galloway continues to remain out. And even with Brexit, I mean, he goes from the Tony Benn school of thinking of basically being a Brexiteer into this thing where he can't even express the fact that he's potentially a Brexiteer. And that was literally the argument that he needed. Like, he was right on the issues, but he couldn't necessarily bring himself to deal with some of those issues because of the people in his party creating this kind of headwind. Am I wrong on that assessment?
No, you're not wrong. I mean, he completely lacked the force of personality that a political leader leading a fundamental movement for major change absolutely needs. He was an enormously likable, warm, gracious human being. I speak from I've never actually met him one-to-one, but I've seen him many times in the flesh. I've attended meetings where he's been. Everybody responds to his warmth, and of course, on top of all of that, he did assemble behind him a huge coalition brimming with ideas for change, which would have been, very good for Britain to have been presented with. But he didn't have that force of personality that a leader needs. But at least he represented an alternative. Starmer is not an alternative. He is more of the same. We would get, Blairism without Blair. That's what it would. That's
without
all
the flair. It was like Blair without the flair. What do you think the people? Do you think the people, if right now they were given that alternative, would respond to that? Because it seems like we're at certain situations. Like, for example, in the United States, Medicare for All gained 9 points over the course of the time for the COVID-19 thing. A few years ago, that would have been unheard of. Like, it wouldn't have even been on the table. And right now, with everything that are going on, the environmental factors are creating somewhat a change of consciousness in America, especially in regards to healthcare, even though there's nobody who's around to deal with that and say, okay, yes, we're going to appropriate that policy. If Britain was given that choice, meaning if it wasn't Starmer, let's say it was Corbyn. Let's say Corbyn made it, was able to still withstand all of the forces that were against him in order to get him out of that spot and stayed in the leadership position. Would this be his moment?
Absolutely. I mean, 2017 is actually the dramatic example, because Labour went into that election because it got all this critical commentary that it was about it was polling around 24%, and then people started to see him as he actually is, hear what he has to say. And there was this enormous surge of support. The party went up from 24% to 40. It's the biggest increase a political party has achieved over the course of an election in, I think, British electoral history. And the same is true, by the way, today. I have no doubt of it. You meet enormous disaffection throughout Britain with the way things are. People are yearning for an alternative. If they were presented with one, which they could believe in, then there would be massive support for it. The trouble is, the cynicism in Britain is now so great that even if somebody comes along, appears to be saying the same sort of things that Corbyn is saying, comes across as, somebody perhaps more effective than Corbyn, people might doubt that he's actually the real thing, because they've been taken for a ride, if you like, so often in the absence of a large political movement, a proper organisation, such as the Labour Party used to be in Britain, such as perhaps in some ways the Democratic Party was in the United States in the 1930s, when Roosevelt was there, though I'm a bit more sceptical about that. But anyway, in the absence of an organised political force, a political movement, it's very difficult to sustain that around one individual. But the desire for those changes exists. I think 2017 proved it conclusively.
Wow, yeah, I agree with you, especially now that we're behind Brexit. It's like
Corbyn,
that was the bell around his throat. Last question, and that goes into the EU for a bit. The EU is an odd duck to me because it seems like it's trying to turn countries into states. If anything happened in Texas, and I'm not a big fan of Texas, but if anything happened in Texas, I would expect the United States, the federal government, to put all powers in order to ensure that Texas is okay. Flood, rain, whatever. God comes back and just says, I'm going to take it out of Texas. We still should help. But how do you do that with countries? I mean, like, from the standpoint of the European Union, they don't have the same financial mechanisms that the U.S. government has from the standpoint of a federal government, even though they require countries to have some level of a balanced economy. The countries aren't sovereign currencies, so they don't control their own currency. How have the individual countries in the EU have had to deal with COVID-19? For example, like in France, for example, after all of the riots and all of the protests that was taking place to try to take Macron out of office, when that was taking place, France decided, okay, we're going to give more money back because we need to try to take the air out of this amount of protests, meaning these people are angry, we need to take some of the steam off of that by having some of them, even if it's a small percentage, see that we're doing something to try to ameliorate the worst aspects of whatever is taking place at the moment. Well, if the EU gave them a pass on that. Now, for Italy, it did not give Italy a pass when Italy wanted to do something similar for their own people in the country, meaning they were picking winners and losers in a way of saying, yes, we're going to allow France to do it, but no, we're not going to allow you to do it. That means that these aren't sovereign currencies that are allowed to basically control the mechanisms of their own government, especially when they need to run larger deficits, or in the case of these places, especially with COVID-19. How did the EU manage for all of these different governments to deal with the increased costs of dealing with COVID-19?
Well, it's not really dealt with it at all. I mean, can I just explain a bit about the EU, because
Absolutely.
it's a very strange construct. I mean, it originally began as a confederation, if you like, of sovereign states. They came together, they discussed trade policy. It was all about trade and commerce and things of that kind, but the states themselves remained sovereign, and they could work together very successfully. It was very successful for a very long time on that basis, and then gradually it began to change, and on top of this sort of confederal structure, you started to get an attempt to create some kind of union structure with what is in effect a kind of proto-government around the European Commission, a kind of proto-parliament with the European Parliament, a very powerful court of justice, and legal mechanisms that enforce its decisions across the entire confederation, which is now called the Union. But bear in mind, it's never really evolved into a proper union, such as the kind you have in the United States. And the central institutions of the EU are not elected. So you don't actually elect the European Commission president. You don't actually elect the European Commission, the European Union's president. I mean, you elect people to the European Parliament, but that is the weakest of these institutions. So what has happened is that you have a system, a sort of two-level system, where you have states whose power has drained away towards this sort of structure at the top, and which have lost power, and you have power going to this system at the top, which is not elected and is highly technocratic, but lacks electoral and democratic legitimacy. So the result is what ancient Greeks called stasis. You have paralysis. So you talk about, how does the European Union have a policy? What is the Europeans' policy to deal with COVID-19? It doesn't have one. It can't actually frame one, because it can't. It doesn't have the tools to do it. It can create problems for individual states. So Italy, for example, finds itself restricted in some of the things it can do to fight a pandemic or to fight the economic consequences of the pandemic. But the European Union itself can't step in and take control and say, look, you have a crisis in Italy and this is how we're going to run it. It can't do those things. And in terms of mobilizing the resources of the entire territory of the European Union to try to resolve crises, it can't do that either, because it doesn't have a proper government. It's not a proper state. It's not a real state. But those component parts of the European Union, which are its various countries, aren't really states, sovereign states either. So they are restricted in what they can do. So you have this very, very strange situation in which nothing ever gets resolved, nothing ever gets settled.
Wait. Just so I'm clear. Wait. Just so I'm clear.
Yeah.
You have, God, that's so bizarre. So you have a situation where the states themselves, meaning the countries, are sovereign up to a point because they don't control their own currency. So it's like, if you don't even control your own money, you can't necessarily call yourself entirely sovereign.
Or even entirely your own laws, because so much law now is made at European Union level.
But by the same token, the European Union can't step in to do those functions that you would need something like a federal government to do, despite the fact that those countries are also not sovereign.
Correct. It doesn't raise taxes. It doesn't have its own army. It doesn't have its police force. It doesn't even have a proper federal civil service. I mean, there's nothing like that. There is a fairly small, by the way, bureaucracy in Brussels with huge powers, but it cannot administer. It doesn't actually really do administration. So it's a very strange system in which everything cancels everything else out. So nothing ever works together to move the thing forward in any way. It's a very strange system. And I think, my own personal view, is the worst of all worlds, because you don't have the benefits of being in a union, a federal union, such as you do in the United States. And you don't have the benefits of being in a sovereign country like you used to have in Germany or France or Britain or Italy or wherever. So you get this very strange mixture of things, which isn't really working very well. Now the big question is, will they move it forward or will it slide back?
They don't have the ability to send money to the various states, or for that matter, expand the budgets of those states.
No, well, the states are restricted in expanding their budgets. This is a very strange thing. They can't they have to keep their deficits within 3% of GDP, which is, in a crisis like this, it's too small. And I mean but that's the law. That is the actual law of the union. They can sometimes get permission to do that, but that is what the European treaties actually say. So they're restricted in how far they can actually raise budgets. They can't, for example, nationalize companies.
Wow,
So
that's
let's
massive.
yeah,
Are
yes,
you
because
serious?
because doing so goes against European competition policy.
That's
So you see,
astonishing.
yeah, exactly. So you are very restricted in what you can do at the sort of sovereign state level, but at the same time, you don't have at federal level the structures to take over and do these things.
No, Boris Johnson is right. You guys have to get out. That's
Well,
horrible. I mean, that's like I understand that the conservatives are talking about, this nonsense of freedom. We're talking about free nonsense. They just wanted
yeah,
to get out because they wanted to have this helter-skelter run to the bottom in regards to cutting regulations.
exactly.
By Labour abandoning the Brexit referendum, they basically allowed Boris Johnson to scream freedom at the height of his lungs every time he got into a mic. I'm going to honor the referendum for the people of
Yeah.
the UK. And so fair enough. But that's horrendous. Like
Yes.
if you have, for example, like let's say like mail. If you had a situation where a previous conservative government, against the will of the population, got rid of the mail service, and then the new government comes in and says, "Well, I want to nationalize mail. I want to put it back into the hands of the public," and it says, "We can't do that." The European Union says that's against competitive rules. So when Jeremy Corbyn, this is so weird. So when
Yes.
Jeremy Corbyn was like, "I'm going to renationalize the railways," that would have been
Yes.
forbidden under the EU guidelines. Meaning
Yeah.
he had to get out of the European Union to even do that.
Yeah, I mean, what he would have needed to do is to get the European Union's permission to do it, not guaranteed. And of course, what the European Union might agree to, the European Court of Justice might veto, because this is always this curious balance between various EU institutions. So it is extremely difficult to move forward with the kind of economic and political agenda that Jeremy Corbyn had within the structure of the European Union. One of the very odd things is that there was clearly a left-wing case to be made for Brexit.
Oh yeah.
But for some reason it was never made.
Yeah.
And this is a very strange paradox. I mean, the reasons why Tony Benn, for example, opposed Britain being in the European Union, which touch on many of the points we made in this programme, are reasons which are never articulated by the left anymore. Because, of course, the left in Britain, I mean, as an organised political force, has become so demoralised and weakened that it's debatable whether it exists anymore. And you're absolutely right. One of the reasons why people of left-wing views mobilised behind the European Union is because Boris Johnson and some very right-wing people of the Conservative Party, who are all about deregulation, free markets, a race to the bottom, abolish everything, minimum wages, you name, because they were for it. So they thought, quite absurdly, that it was the European Union that was protecting them, even though, in fact, it is not the European Union. It was Britain itself that passed all its rules, for example, on race, sex discrimination, prohibiting all those things. They came from Britain. It was Britain that passed health and safety regulations. It was Britain that passed its own trade union protections, all of those things. But people thought wrongly that it was the European Union that would protect them from the Conservatives. And this was a very difficult argument that I found myself having with lots of people over that time.
Yeah, wow, you're right. For the most part, they looked at it and said, well, it's right wingers that want to get out. And so in opposition needs to stay in. And
Yes.
it's like, well, you don't have to opposition stay in. I mean, you literally could make the left wing argument to get out. In fact, it almost assumes that you're going to lose. Right?
Yes.
I mean, because it's like the European Union is the thing that's going to protect us, as opposed to, well, if we win, we can keep our regulations in play in the same way that we have our regulations to begin with. It's like you don't need this superior body to stop. It would be like if somebody in the U.S. government says, okay, well, we need to stay within this body structure because the United States can't make laws in and of itself to protect itself. Like it's a strange logic. I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I should say very clearly though. I mean, I am somebody who's very much in favour of European states cooperating with each other within a proper democratic framework. I'm all in favour of that. But this structure that the European Union has evolved in at the moment, I think it's not just unsustainable, but I think it's actually stifling. I think it is suffocating political change. And people talk a lot about, the rise of, the extreme right in all sorts of places. I'm not sure to what extent some of these movements can really be called right-wing, but, let's assume that's what they are. I think that is a response to the fact, again, that because of the European Union structures and the greater forces that we have been talking about, an organised left within Europe is becoming impossible, because you can't carry out the kind of social democratic program that you once could.
Yeah, inside the EU. Wow, thank you, man. I really do appreciate this conversation. Alexander Mercouris, editor of the Duran Legal Scholar, thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it. All right, guys, I am going to end this here.
Okay, well, what do you say about it? Let's talk about them, yeah. Sorry about the dog and the ring on the door.
Oh, no, you're fine. But Alexander Mercouris, the host of the Duran, editor-in-chief, legal scholar, thank you for coming on to the show. Guys, I'm going to end this here. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks all. Yeah, great conversation, man.